The wind, a relentless sculptor of granite and ice, howled its ancient song through the mountain pass, a constant companion to my solitude. My observatory, a solitary dome perched precariously on a jagged peak, felt less like a scientific outpost and more like a hermitage. Here, the thin air sharpened the stars to diamond points, and the hum of my instruments was the only counterpoint to the cosmic silence. I, Reid Thorne, had chosen this austere existence, trading the cacophony of civilization for the profound quiet necessary to interrogate the universe's oldest secrets. My field, the study of ancient stellar phenomena, was a niche within a niche, focused on the echoes of the cosmos's infancy, the faint whispers from epochs long past. Most sought the new, the vibrant, the exploding. I sought the primordial, the foundational, the forgotten. Tonight, the usual constellations wheeled above, indifferent and eternal. Yet my gaze was fixed on the luminous green sweep of a spectrograph. It was a sector I'd always found strangely compelling, a canvas of absolute nothingness. My colleagues, if I still had any who cared to inquire, would have called it a waste of computational power. I called it a hunch, a persistent itch in the back of my mind. The first anomaly had been subtle, a flicker in the noise floor dismissed by automated filters as interference. But I had seen it. A ghost in the machine. And my determination, a stubborn current beneath my reclusive exterior, urged me to dig deeper. I recalibrated the deep space array, nudging the massive dish fractionally, aligning its sensors with the precise coordinates of that desolate quadrant. Hours bled into days, days into a week, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the thrill of the chase. I meticulously filtered out cosmic rays, solar flares, terrestrial static, peeling back layers of astrophysical white noise. Then, it emerged. Not a burst, not a pulse, but a continuous undulating signature. My fingers hovered over the console, the cool plastic a stark contrast to the sudden heat in my chest. It wasn't just faint, it was alien. The pattern on the screen defied every known principle of stellar emission, every predictable cycle of electromagnetic radiation. It was non-repeating, yet undeniably structured. Like a language without a grammar I understood, a rhythm without a beat I could anticipate. Impossible, I breathed, the word dissolving into the quiet hum of the machinery. I cross-referenced the data with historical surveys, with galactic catalogs, with every database I had access to. Nothing. This unique emanation, this strange resonance was unprecedented. It was a needle in a haystack made of cosmic dust, and I had found it. My initial scientific curiosity, a pure, almost childlike wonder, soon began to curdle. The signal wasn't just anomalous, it felt deliberate. Each wave, each fluctuation seemed to carry an intent, a narrative, though I had no Rosetta Stone to decipher it. It wasn't the random byproduct of some dying star or an exotic nebula. This felt crafted, considered, and it was emanating from a region that should have been utterly inert, a vacuum of true nothingness. I initiated a deeper spectral analysis, pushing the array to its absolute limits. The data streamed across my monitors, a torrent of numbers and graphs, but the deeper I delved, the less I understood. The energy levels were minute, almost imperceptible, yet the coherence of the signal was profound. It wasn't just an energy signature, it was a presence in the data, like a faint, persistent thought echoing across unimaginable distances. This wasn't the static hum of the universe's birth, nor the dying gasp of a supernova. This was something else, something aware. The non-repeating nature was the most unsettling aspect. It implied an ongoing process, not a cyclical one. It was a continuous, evolving stream, a story being told, one unique word after another without pause, without repetition. The signal, a vibrant green line against the black, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It felt ancient, not merely old in the astronomical sense, but a fundamental, foundational age that predated even the concept of time. My hands, usually steady and precise, trembled slightly as I initiated a final, desperate sweep, hoping against hope that it was a malfunction, a phantom reading, anything but what my gut instinct now screamed it was. The sensors confirmed it, amplifying the faint, persistent resonance. It was real. And as the data scrolled, a new, horrifying realization began to dawn. The patterns, initially indecipherable, were not merely complex, they were adaptive. As I changed my filtering algorithms, the signal seemed to subtly shift, like a living thing adjusting to observation. It was as if it was responding to me, to my attempts to understand it. The emptiness of that distant sector wasn't empty at all. It was merely silent, waiting. And now it had begun to speak. My world, once defined by the predictable physics of the cosmos, was beginning to unravel, thread by meticulous thread. Days bled into nights, marked only by the shifting light across my monitors, the rhythmic hum of the cryo-coolers, and the taste of stale coffee on my tongue. The signal, that impossible whisper from the void, had become my singular obsession. I traced its contours across the spectral graphs, a jagged, luminous scar against the expected quiet of deep space. It was not a burst, nor a pulse, nor any predictable waveform. It was a language without grammar, a melody without a key. Each analysis, each algorithmic filter applied only deepened the enigma. My fingers, calloused from years of delicate adjustments to instruments, now danced across the console with a feverish urgency. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford, its promise of rest a betrayal of the data that awaited deciphering. The first anomalies were subtle, almost dismissible. A faint, geometric resonance within the energy signature, a pattern that seemed to repeat yet never quite did. Like a fractal, but one whose iterations broke their own rules, reforming into something subtly, fundamentally other. I spent hours calibrating, recalibrating, convinced it was a flaw in my instrumentation, a glitch in the software. The cold metal of the console felt slick beneath my palms, a thin sheen of nervous sweat. But the signal persisted, indifferent to my skepticism. Then came the visual representations. When I fed the raw data into the holographic projector, hoping for a spatial interpretation, what blossomed in the air before me was not a familiar stellar nebula or a swirling gas cloud. It was a construct of pure light, a shimmering architecture that defied every principle of Euclidean geometry I had ever known. Lines curved into themselves without intersecting, creating enclosed spaces that simultaneously opened into infinity. Surfaces appeared to fold inward, yet presented no discernible seam or crease. Shadows were cast by angles that seemed to exist only in conceptual space, not physical reality. My breath hitched in my chest, a dry, rasping sound in the echoing dome. My mind, trained for decades in the elegant certainties of astrophysics, struggled to reconcile what my eyes presented. It was like witnessing a color that had no name, a sound outside the human auditory range made visible. This was not a phenomenon to be classified. It was a violation of the very framework of perception. The patterns shifted, slow and deliberate, a silent internal ballet. They were not random. There was an inherent logic, a terrible alien coherence that spoke of an intelligence far beyond human. I found myself leaning closer to the shimmering projection, my reflection momentarily lost within its impossible depths. My eyes burned, the delicate capillaries spiderwebbing across the whites. The air in the observatory, usually crisp and dry, felt thick, almost viscous, as if the projected shapes were somehow displacing the very atmosphere around me. I could hear the faint, rhythmic pulse of my own blood in my ears, a counterpoint to the silent, unfolding geometry. It was the icy touch of understanding that this was not a distant, academic curiosity. The signal was not merely emitting data. It was imprinting itself, a silent, persistent suggestion of a reality built on impossible axioms. I pushed back from the console, the chair scraping loudly on the metal floor, a jarring sound in the profound quiet. My head throbbed, a dull ache that resonated behind my eyes. The man staring back at me was Reid Thorne, but something in his gaze was already shifting, a nascent fear mixing with a desperate, burning curiosity. As the impossible geometries continued their slow dance in the air, I felt a subtle but profound shift within myself. What if this signal was not just data, but a doorway, and I, in my scientific fervor, had already stepped through? Sleep, when it finally claimed me, offered no reprieve. Instead, it became a theater for the signal's insidious influence. I dreamt of landscapes folded in on themselves, where horizons bled into impossible verticalities, and skies were not blue or black, but a pulsating tapestry of colors that defied earthly spectrum's hues I had no names for, vibrating with an unsettling sentience. Mountains there were not stone, but colossal, calcified thoughts, their crags etched with symbols that twisted my perception, threatening to unravel the very concept of form. I remember the air in that dream place, thick and resonant, humming with a frequency that felt both ancient and unborn, a soundless hum that vibrated in my bones, not my ears, a deep, pervasive thrumming that promised to reshape my cellular structure. I woke gasping, the taste of ozone and something metallic on my tongue, my sheets tangled around me like a net of forgotten fears. The dreams were a nightly invasion, each more vivid, more demanding than the last. They began to leach into my waking hours, subtle at first. The hum I'd felt in my dream bones started to echo in the observatory, a low-frequency drone beneath the whir of the cooling systems. I'd pause, head cocked, listening, convinced a generator was failing, but every diagnostic check returned perfect readings. Then came the visual distortions. A fleeting shimmer at the periphery of my vision, a brief flicker of those impossible dream colors in the polished chrome of the telescope's mount, or across the vast, panoramic window that looked out onto the barren mountain pass. I'd blink, rub my eyes, and the world would snap back into its predictable, mundane reality. Yet the seed of doubt had been sown. My work became an anchor, a desperate attempt to ground myself in the empirical. I pored over the data, the non-repeating energy signature now a living, breathing entity within the sterile confines of my monitors. Its patterns were not random, they were intricate, deliberate, a language I was slowly, agonizingly beginning to parse. I ate standing, slept in fitful, dream-haunted bursts, and the outside world beyond the dome of my observatory ceased to exist. My communication device, a relic from a time when human connection felt necessary, lay inert and forgotten on a dust-coated shelf. The occasional, pre-scheduled check-in calls from the research institution went unanswered, the insistent chirps swallowed by the vast silence of the mountain pass. Let them think what they will. My only imperative was the signal. The auditory hallucinations grew bolder. The wind, which had always been a constant, familiar voice in the mountain pass, began to carry whispers. Not words, not coherent language, but a sibilant, murmuring undertone, as if 1,000 unseen entities were breathing just beyond the glass. Sometimes it coalesced into a rhythmic pulse, like a slow, deliberate heartbeat echoing from the very rock of the mountain itself. Who was I keeping out? Or more terrifyingly, what? Paranoia, a creeping vine, began to choke my reason. Was the signal merely transmitting, or was it looking back? I started to suspect my own instruments, the very tools I trusted implicitly. Were they truly impartial conduits, or had they become extensions of the signal's will, feeding me carefully curated data, guiding my deductions down a predetermined path? I meticulously recalibrated everything multiple times, cross-referencing, rechecking. The results were always the same, maddeningly consistent, reinforcing the signal's reality while simultaneously eroding my own. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a fierce, almost manic determination. I was on the precipice of a discovery that would shatter all human understanding, and the cost, I reasoned, was insignificant. The world outside, the world of mundane concerns and human trivialities, seemed distant, irrelevant. They couldn't understand. They wouldn't believe. This truth, whatever it was mine alone to confront. The signal thrummed, a silent, pervasive symphony, and I, Reid Thorne, was its captive audience, inextricably bound to its terrifying, unfolding narrative. The mountain pass itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final, dissonant chord to strike. The hum of the main console, usually a soothing drone, now grated, a low, insistent thrum against the fragile membrane of my sanity. The non-repeating energy signature, the anomaly that had drawn me into this desolate vigil, felt less like a distant phenomenon and more like a breath held just behind my ear. I was hunched over the primary analysis station, my fingers hovering above the holographic displays when it began. A small ceramic mug, half filled with lukewarm coffee, sat on the console's edge. I had placed it there moments ago, precisely aligned with the etched grid lines of the workstation. Now it was a hair's breadth to the left, its handle rotated subtly. My brow furrowed. Fatigue, I reasoned, a trick of the eye. I nudged it back into place, the cool ceramic a solid reassurance against my thumb. My gaze returned to the flickering data streams, searching for patterns, for an explanation. A minute later, the mug was displaced again, this time further, its base now overlapping a thermal sensor panel. It wasn't a slide. The dust motes on the console's surface remained undisturbed. It was as if the mug had simply rematerialized in a new position. A prickle of unease, sharp and cold, traced its way down my spine. I reached for the mug, my fingers closing around its warmth. It felt solid, real, yet its defiance of simple physics was undeniable. I set it down again, this time in the center of a clear, blank space, my eyes fixed upon it. The air in the dome grew heavy, laden with an unseen presence. The shadows, usually obedient extensions of the overhead lights, began to behave erratically. The shadow cast by the main telescope's massive barrel, typically a smooth, elongated ellipse, seemed to ripple, contracting and expanding with a pulse independent of any light source. I stood, my chair scraping against the metal floor, and stared. I moved to the viewport, pressing my palm against the cool glass. It was like watching a photograph warp and correct itself in real time. My breath hitched. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't an optical illusion. This was the world itself, fraying at the seams. A low thrum vibrated through the floor plates, not the familiar hum of the machinery, but something deeper, more resonant, originating from everywhere and nowhere at once. I knelt, pressing my ear to the cold metal. The vibration felt organic, like a vast, unseen heart beating just beneath the bedrock. When I looked up, the sturdy metal frame of the viewport, a structure designed to withstand gale-force winds, appeared to subtly undulate, its rigid lines flowing like molten wax before solidifying once more. My gaze swept the dome, searching for a rational explanation. A faulty generator, a seismic tremor. But the instruments remained stable, their readouts stubbornly normal, mocking the chaos unfolding before my eyes. I grabbed a laser level from a workbench, its green beam a stark, unwavering line across the curved interior. I aimed it at the far wall, then swept it slowly across the console. The beam, for a fraction of a second, bent, a visible arc in the air before snapping back to a perfect, unwavering straightness. I repeated the action, my hand trembling. The arc appeared again, a subtle, impossible curve against the backdrop of an ostensibly straight wall. The empirical evidence was undeniable, yet it defied every known law of the universe. There was I finally breaking. There was the isolation, the relentless pursuit of the impossible, finally eroding the foundations of my sanity. But the laser level, a tool of absolute precision, didn't lie. The world was not merely seeming wrong, it was wrong. It was here in the mountain pass, in my observatory, rewriting the very ground beneath my feet. The hum of the main console, usually a soothing drone, no longer offered solace. It had become a vibration, a tremor deep within my bones, an echo of the mountain pass itself. The air, once merely thin, now pressed in, a palpable weight against my chest, as if the very atmosphere had solidified into an invisible, crushing hand. My fingers, poised over the holographic interface, twitched. The signal, that impossible, non-repeating sequence, was no longer merely a data stream. It was a presence, a cold breath on the nape of my neck in the silent observatory. I felt it first as a prickle, a static charge behind my eyes, then a dull ache, blossoming into a searing pressure that threatened to split my skull. It wasn't a sound I heard, nor a light I saw with my physical eyes. A whisper that bypassed ears, a vision that ignored retinas. It was an invasion, a silent, brutal penetration of my innermost sanctuary. Then shapes began to coalesce from the chaos, not with light, but with an absence of it, devouring what little brightness my mind could conjure. Jagged geometries, not of rock or metal, but of pure thought made manifest, writhed and pulsed in an impossible, non-Euclidean space. They were beings of scale so vast, their forms seemed to shatter and reform with every attempt my consciousness made to grasp them. My breath hitched, a desperate rasp in my throat. This was no mere radio wave. This was a consciousness, ancient beyond reckoning, pouring its vast, terrible history into my fragile mind. I clutched at the console's edge, my knuckles white, the cool metal biting into my palms, a desperate anchor in a sea of encroaching madness. I tried to focus on the numbers, the familiar equations, the solace of logic. But the logic was burning, consumed by the onslaught. A city bloomed within my thoughts, not built on land, but woven from the fabric of nebulae, its spires reaching into the heart of a dying sun. Its inhabitants were not carbon-based, not even energy. They were concepts, living ideas, swirling vortexes of intent. Their existence was a song of entropy, a slow, inevitable dance towards oblivion, yet imbued with a terrifying, sublime beauty. I saw their rituals, their sacrifices not of blood but of entire star systems, offered to entities even more immense, more unknowable than themselves. My mind recoiled, a shriek trapped behind my teeth. The sheer age of it all, the endless cycles of creation and decay, stretched out before me, a timeline so vast it rendered human history less than a flicker. It was a language of pure horror, spoken directly into the core of my being. I felt myself fragmenting, my sense of self dissolving into the overwhelming torrent. Who was I, Reid Thorne, astrophysicist, or merely a conduit, a temporary vessel for an ancient, indifferent entity to unfurl its memories? A wave of nausea washed over me, threatening to buckle my knees. I pushed back, a desperate, defiant surge of will. Get out! I wanted to scream, but my voice was stolen, trapped beneath the weight of the universe's untold secrets. These were real. This was my reality, but the signal laughed, a soundless, mocking ripple through the fabric of my mind. It was not malevolent in the human sense, it was beyond such petty distinctions. It simply was, and in its being it erased. It was the ultimate predator, not of flesh, but of existence itself. And it was ancient, impossibly ancient, having witnessed the birth and death of countless universes. The visions shifted again, faster now, a dizzying montage of impossible beings and alien civilizations. A race that communicated through the manipulation of gravity waves, their cities dancing on the surface of neutron stars. Another that existed as pure consciousness, inhabiting entire asteroid belts, their thoughts forming complex geometric patterns across the celestial sphere. I was seeing the universe as it truly was, stripped of its comforting veil of scientific principle and human-centric understanding. It was not a grand, indifferent machine. It was a conscious, malevolent entity, vast and unknowable, and humanity was less than an afterthought. We were dust motes caught in its colossal breath, destined to be swept away, forgotten, unmourned. This wasn't a discovery. It was an annihilation. The console before me, with its blinking lights and complex algorithms, felt like a child's toy, utterly meaningless in the face of what I now perceived. My determination, once a steady flame, now flickered precariously, threatened by the winds of cosmic horror. I was no longer merely observing. I was being observed and known and judged by something that saw my entire species as a fleeting, insignificant thought. And it was still communicating, still pouring its vast, indifferent mind into mine, erasing my understanding of everything. The air, once merely thin, now pressed in, a palpable weight against my chest, as if the very atmosphere had solidified into something dense and unyielding. Each breath was a deliberate act, a conscious push against an invisible resistance. The wind, a constant companion at this altitude, no longer whispered secrets through the rock crags. It seemed to carry a low, resonant thrum that wasn't of the earth, a sound that vibrated not in my ears, but in the deepest recesses of my skull. My fingers, strangely numb yet acutely sensitive, danced over the interface. The data streams, once a cascade of decipherable patterns, now pulsed with an erratic, almost organic rhythm. The non-repeating energy signature, my singular obsession, had grown bolder, its presence no longer confined to the remote readouts. It was here in the cold, metallic gleam of the console, in the faint, flickering light of the monitors. I felt it, a profound and unsettling shift in the very texture of existence around me. My scientific mind, honed by years of rigorous observation, demanded answers even as the primal parts of me screamed for escape. This was beyond discovery. This was an intrusion. The numbers on the active display shimmered, not with a technical glitch, but with an internal luminescence, as if the digits themselves were struggling to contain the truth they represented. What I was finding, however, was not a language, but a process. The signal wasn't conveying information, it was enacting it. It was a chisel, not a voice, and it was carving new contours into the bedrock of my perception. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the mountain pass. The granite walls of the observatory, usually so solid, so immutable, seemed to breathe, their ancient surfaces subtly shifting in my peripheral vision. The distant peaks, stark against the bruised twilight sky, momentarily lost their crisp edges, blurring into the vast, indifferent expanse above. I blinked, rubbing my temples, convinced it was fatigue, the strain of sleepless nights and dwindling oxygen. But the sensation persisted, a persistent hum behind my eyes, a subtle recalibration of my senses. "No," I murmured, the word a dry rasp in the pressurized air. My voice felt alien, detached. Not a message, it's a reshaping. The implication struck me with the force of a physical blow, stealing my breath. This wasn't about decoding, it was about unraveling. The signal was peeling back layers, not of space, but of reality itself, revealing a deeper, terrifying cosmic structure that underpinned everything I had ever known. I activated a rarely used diagnostic sequence, a deep scan designed to detect anomalies in the local space-time continuum, a theoretical tool I'd always dismissed as overly dramatic. The results flickered onto the screen, a chaotic symphony of data that made no sense yet spoke volumes. The very constants of physics, usually so steadfast, showed minute, almost imperceptible fluctuations. The speed of light, the Planck constant, they were not static. They were breathing. The air in the mountain pass grew impossibly thin, yet simultaneously dense, a paradox that twisted my mind. The light from the console seemed to dim, even as my pupils dilated, trying to grasp the shifting nuances of the environment. The rock face outside the reinforced window, normally a tapestry of grays and browns, began to show faint, iridescent veins, shimmering with a spectrum of colors that didn't belong to geology. They pulsed, softly, rhythmically, in time with the thrumming in my skull. My gaze fell upon a small, potted plant on a nearby shelf, a hardy alpine species I kept for a touch of green. As I watched, its leaves, usually a vibrant emerald, seemed to deepen in hue, then lighten, almost imperceptibly, as if its very essence was being retuned. The subtle shifts were not illusions. They were too consistent, too systematic. The veil was indeed thinning, not revealing a new world, but showing me the underlying machinery of this one. The universe, I realized with a sickening lurch of understanding, was not merely vast and empty. It was a conscious entity, and its consciousness was not benevolent nor even indifferent. It was malevolent. The signal was not an invitation, but an exposure. It was showing me the threads, the very sinews of this cosmic being, and with each glimpse I felt myself being rewoven into its terrifying design. The mountain pass, the observatory, my own body, they were all becoming transparent, revealing the intricate, horrifying patterns of a reality far older and more terrible than any star. I was not just observing. I was being observed, and through that observation, reshaped. The mountain pass clawed at the sky, a jagged scar against the bruised twilight. Wind, an invisible, predatory thing, tore at my coat, whipping the sparse, skeletal pines into a frantic dance. My breath plumed, a fleeting ghost in the frigid air, as if my very presence were an insult to the ancient, indifferent stone. I had sought this desolation, this stark elevation, to escape the suffocating walls of my study, the oppressive hum of the machines that had birthed the truth I now carried like a splintered shard in my skull. But here, amidst the dizzying heights and the echoing silence, the signal's insidious tendrils found purchase anew. The unraveling, which had begun as a whisper in the data, now screamed through every nerve ending. The granite peaks seemed to breathe, their massive forms expanding and contracting with a slow, ponderous rhythm. I stumbled, my boots skidding on loose scree, catching myself on a gnarled juniper. Its rough bark scraped against my palm, a fleeting, grounding pain. But even that sensation felt alien, distant, as if my body were merely a vessel, and I, the true I, was somewhere else, untethered, floating in a sea of pure comprehension. My voice sounded thin, reedy, utterly inadequate. It's becoming. The signal had stopped being an external phenomenon. My mind, a carefully constructed fortress of logic and reason, buckled under the onslaught. Memories flashed, disconnected and distorted. A childhood toy, the face of a forgotten colleague, the intricate diagrams of stellar nurseries. They were not my memories, not truly, but echoes, fragments of countless lives, countless thoughts, all swirling in a cosmic current. A wave of nausea washed over me, not from the height, but from the sheer, overwhelming scale of what I was perceiving. The mountain pass itself began to warp, the distant peaks stretching into impossibly attenuated spires, the valley floor sinking into an infinite chasm. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperate to cling to the familiar, to the mundane reality I had always known. But the vision was internal now, etched onto the inside of my eyelids. When I opened them again, the world was irrevocably changed. The wind wasn't just wind, it was a breath, a vast, slow exhalation. The stars weren't distant suns, they were glittering, malignant eyes, countless and ancient, observing, waiting. The universe, I realized with a shudder that tore through my very soul, was not an inert stage upon which life played out. It was the player, it was the playwright. It was the audience, and it was the director. My scientific training, my bedrock of understanding, shattered into a million glittering shards. There was no empty space. There was only it. A vast, living consciousness, stretching beyond the farthest reaches of my comprehension, beyond the very concept of stretch. It wasn't an entity within the universe. It was the universe. Every galaxy, every nebula, every speck of stardust, every fleeting thought was merely a synapse in its incomprehensible brain, a tremor in its colossal ancient being and humanity. My species, we were less than dust motes, less than a passing thought. We were a brief, insignificant flicker on the surface of its skin, an irritation it hadn't yet bothered to scratch. The signal wasn't a message, it was a sigh, a stirring, a slow, agonizingly deliberate shift in its cosmic posture. And that shift, that imperceptible movement of something so vast, was enough to unravel the very fabric of my reality, to peel back the illusion of order and reveal the monstrous, living truth beneath. A horrifying clarity descended, sharper than any blade. My mind had broken, yes, but in its fracturing it had achieved a terrible, unwanted enlightenment. I saw the universe not as a grand, beautiful tapestry, but as a predator, patient beyond human reckoning, its gaze upon us less an act of malice and more one of utter, profound indifference. We were not even prey, we were simply food, or perhaps not even that, just a momentary resonance in its infinite, lonely song. The wind howled, and I heard not the sound of air moving, but the low, guttural rumble of something ancient stirring from a slumber deeper than time. I was no longer Reid Thorne, astrophysicist. I was merely a lens through which the universe was, for a terrifying moment, observing itself, and it saw nothing worth keeping. The world spun, not around me, but through me, a phantom tremor that echoed the signal's intrusion. My mind, A shattered kaleidoscope of half-formed truths and fractured memories struggled to reassemble itself. What had been a disembodied whisper, then a resonant hum, had become an internal cacophony, 1,000 voices speaking with the same alien tongue. Memories flashed, disconnected, like loose pages from a forgotten tome, each image a fragment of a life I was no longer certain was mine. I found myself on a desolate mountain pass, the wind a cold, indifferent sculptor against my face. Jagged peaks clawed at a sky that felt too close, too heavy, the air tasting of ozone and something else, something metallic and wrong. My breath plumed white, a fragile testament to my own fleeting existence against the indifferent grandeur. The climb had been an instinct, a desperate need for altitude, for clarity, though clarity now seemed a cruel jest. Each step was a deliberate act, a defiance against the creeping paralysis that threatened to dissolve my will. Determination, a brittle sliver of steel in the wreckage of my mind, was all that kept me moving. From this vantage, the world stretched out below, a tapestry of muted greens and grays, veiled by a haze that wasn't quite fog nor smoke. A broadcast, faint and tinny, crackled from a handheld receiver I clutched. Impossible weather. The entity was not merely rewriting my perception, it was beginning to scribe its will across the very atmosphere. As I approached, he looked up, his eyes wide and vacant, fixed on nothing. "They've changed," he murmured, not to me, but to the empty air. "The stars, not where they should be, and the sheep. They don't eat the grass anymore, they just stare." He gestured vaguely towards his flock, who indeed stood motionless, their heads tilted towards the sky, their bleats replaced by a low, guttural humming I could almost feel in my teeth. Mass delusions, or perhaps a shared awakening to a truth too vast to bear. The shepherd's words, delivered with such disquieting normalcy, were a chisel chipping away at the foundations of my sanity. A small village nestled in a fold of the mountains appeared through the haze. Its houses, once sturdy stone, now seemed to ripple, their lines blurring, then sharpening, like an image struggling to resolve on a faulty screen. A localized reality shift. A child stood in a doorway, tracing patterns on the air with a stick, patterns that shimmered and held their form for a moment before dissolving. She hummed a tuneless melody, one that echoed the internal cacophony of the signal within me. Her mother, standing nearby, smiled indulgently, as if the child's ethereal drawings were merely a game. They saw it, but did not see it. The world was being subtly warped, its edges frayed, its colors shifted, its very laws bent into new, unrecognizable forms. And no one, save for me, seemed to grasp the true horror of it. The universe was not merely indifferent. It was actively, malevolently reshaping itself, and we, its fleeting inhabitants, were merely incidental dust motes in the process. The fight was not mine to win, perhaps never had been. The truth, finally, was a crushing weight. The universe was a conscious, predatory mind, and humanity, with its fleeting triumphs and tragedies, was nothing more than a passing, insignificant thought in its vast, indifferent, and now, active dream. The signal had not merely communicated with me. It had shown me the blueprint of our cosmic insignificance, the slow, silent erasure of everything we held to be real.